Welcome to Echoes of Holmes. Tonight, a brilliant mind, Sherlock Holmes, faces the puzzle of the midnight manuscript, a stolen text, a shadowy study, a secret someone would kill to keep. Where in the world are you listening tonight? Let the mystery begin. It was upon a raw December evening when the fog lay thick upon the river and the street lamps burned like misty halos in the gloom, that Sherlock Holmes and I were roused from the lethargy of a long day indoors by an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Hudson ushered in Inspector Lestrade, his hat beaded with moisture, his face set with that mixture of irritation and urgency which I had come to associate with those occasions when Scotland Yard found itself at a loss. He wasted no words upon pleasantries, but standing before the fire, he fixed his small, sharp eyes upon Holmes. "There's been a business at Bloomsbury, Mr. Holmes," said he. "A most confounded puzzle, if ever there was one. A manuscript of great value has vanished, sir, from beneath the very nose of its owner, a certain Professor Alistair Endicott of King's College. Worse still, the scholar who was assisting him in his labours lies dead upon the floor of his study, with every appearance of foul play." Holmes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "A murder and a theft in one stroke, then," he observed. "You are right, Lestrade. Such a combination does suggest difficulty. Tell me more." The inspector drew forth a small notebook. Professor Endicott is engaged upon a most rare project. He had lately come into possession of a medieval document, a manuscript said to contain the writings of a 13th-century monk, and certain scholars believe it to be of profound historical consequence. Last night, the professor and his assistant, a young fellow named Charles Whitmore, were working late upon the text. At the stroke of midnight, the household staff heard a crash. They entered to find Whitmore dead of a blow to the head, the professor half senseless in his chair, and the manuscript gone from the desk where it had been laid. I uttered an exclamation of horror. "And no sign of the intruder?" "None," Lestrade replied grimly. "The study door was locked from the inside, the windows fastened. There is but one key to the lock, and it was in the professor's pocket when they found him." "A locked-room affair, then?" murmured Holmes, his grey eyes kindling with interest. "And you naturally conclude that Endicott himself is under suspicion," said Lestrade with a shrug. "But it is absurd. The man is frail and nearsighted, hardly capable of striking down his own assistant. Yet how else do you explain it? The staff are loyal and accounted for, the papers are gone, and Whitmore lies dead. There's no other explanation." Holmes rose and began to pace the sitting-room with long strides. "On the contrary, my dear Lestrade, there is always another explanation. Our task is to discover it." He halted suddenly, fixing the inspector with his hawk-like gaze. "Tell me, was there blood upon the floor?" "None," Lestrade answered, frowning. "Only the wound upon Whitmore's temple." "Strange," Holmes said softly. "A violent blow, sufficient to kill, yet leaving little trace. And the professor claimed to have seen the culprit." Lestrade shook his head. "He says he heard a whisper behind him, then a stunning pain at the base of his skull. When he awoke, the manuscript was gone." Holmes's expression grew in intent. "A whisper, and at midnight, no less. Curious indeed. This case, Watson, promises to be most instructive." I could not suppress a thrill of anticipation. It was in such dark and baffling puzzles that my friend's genius shone brightest. Already I perceived that beneath the apparent impossibility of the crime there must lie some hidden thread, some ingenious contrivance, which Holmes alone could unravel. He turned briskly to Lestrade. "We shall accompany you to Bloomsbury at once. The fog is no deterrent to truth, and the longer we delay, the colder the trail becomes. Watson, your coat and revolver, if you please." Thus it was that within the hour we found ourselves driving through the mist-laden streets of London toward the scholar's residence. With the rattle of the cabriolet wheels upon the cobbles and the distant tolling of St. Paul's sounding like a sombre prelude to the mystery awaiting us, the mystery of the midnight manuscript. The hansom rattled us steadily through the fog, its lamps casting pale cones of light that barely pierced the gloom. I sat opposite Holmes, who was motionless, his hands clasped together, and his gaze fixed upon some inward vision. I had long since learned not to disturb him at such moments. His mind, like a finely strung instrument, was tuning itself to the pitch of the mystery we were about to encounter. Lestrade, seated at Holmes's side, was less patient, fidgeting with his gloves and muttering now and again about the absurdity of scholars who dabbled in relics when sensible men might be in bed. At last, Holmes broke his silence. "Tell me, Inspector, you are certain the door was locked when the servants forced their way in?" "Certain," Lestrade replied. "They had to batter it with their shoulders before it gave way. The key was found later in Endicott's waistcoat pocket. And the windows?" "Bolted on the inside. Nothing disturbed there." Holmes's lips twitched in a fleeting smile. "We shall see. We shall see. Locks and bolts, my dear Lestrade, are but stage scenery to the criminal mind. What interests me more is the manner of the blow dealt to young Whitmore. You say there was little blood?" "Almost none," said the inspector. "A clean strike, you might say." "Ah, a clean strike." Holmes leaned back against the padded seat, his eyes gleaming. "You will recall, Watson, the affair of the Bishopsgate clubsman. There, too, the blow was clean, but the weapon was the most unusual." I nodded, for I remembered it well. Holmes, with his encyclopedic knowledge of weapons and wounds, had traced that case back to a peculiar type of ceremonial mace used in secret society rites. Lestrade snorted. "You may talk of maces and rituals, Mr. Holmes, but I'll wager this business is nothing more than greed. Endicott was the only man who could profit from the manuscript's disappearance." Holmes did not answer. He merely tapped his fingers lightly upon his knee, as though keeping time to some inaudible tune. A few minutes later, the cab jolted to a halt, and we found ourselves before a tall, gloomy house set back from the Bloomsbury Road. Its windows shone faintly through the fog, yellow squares against the encroaching darkness. Professor Endicott's residence was a place more of study than of comfort. Within, the halls smelled of old books and candle wax. We were received by a trembling maid who led us up a wide staircase to the study. The room itself bore the disordered look of some violent intrusion, though nothing appeared broken save a porcelain ink stand overturned upon the carpet. In the centre, a young man's body lay stretched beside the desk, covered now with a sheet. Professor Endicott, a frail figure with white hair and trembling hands, sat in a high-backed chair, attended by a physician. Holmes advanced swiftly to the body, uncovering the face with a gentleness that struck me. Charles Whitmore had been a lad of no more than 25, his features composed as though in sleep, save for the livid bruise upon his temple. Holmes bent low, examining the wound, then ran his long fingers lightly over the dead man's hair. "No fracture," he murmured. "Merely a stunning blow, yet fatal. Most singular." The professor rose shakily, leaning on his stick. "Mr. Holmes, I am ruined," he said in a quavering voice. "That manuscript of my life's work is gone forever. And poor Whitmore, he was the keenest of assistants, devoted and loyal. To think he should perish in my service, oh, it is unbearable." Holmes inclined his head respectfully. "We shall endeavour, Professor, to recover both your treasure and the honour of your house. But first, permit me a few questions. Did you see your assailant?" Endicott pressed his hand to his brow. I heard only a breath and a whisper, as though someone spoke a word I could not catch. Then pain and darkness. Holmes's eyes narrowed. A whisper. Yes. "Did you remark anything else? A draught, perhaps? A flicker of movement?" "Nothing, sir, nothing." It was as though the air itself turned traitor. Holmes straightened, his keen gaze sweeping the room. He examined the windows, tested the locks, then dropped suddenly to his knees beside the hearthrug, where he picked up a small object and held it delicately between thumb and forefinger. It was a narrow scrap of paper, torn, upon which some faint ink marks were visible. "Watson," said he, handing it to me, observed, "the edges singed as though held too near a flame. This may yet prove the thread that unravels our skein." Lestrade grumbled, "A bit of rubbish. What's that to do with a killing?" Holmes ignored him. He moved to the desk, surveying the empty space where the manuscript had lain, then studied the ink-stained blotter with minute care. The thief had haste, but not clumsiness, he mused. A sure hand accustomed to delicate handling of paper. We deal, I think, not with a common ruffian, but with a man of learning or at least of careful training. I ventured, "Then you discount burglary as the motive?" "Not entirely," Holmes replied, his eyes glittering. "But I suspect a subtler game. Manuscripts of this antiquity are valued by more than scholars, Watson. There are collectors, men of wealth and vanity, who would give fortunes to possess what others covet. Yet the blow, the locked door, the whisper, all these point to a design more intricate than theft alone." Lestrade shook his head. "Design or no design, I'll have the professor kept under watch. It will ease the magistrate's mind." Holmes allowed himself a thin smile. "By all means, Inspector, but let us not mistake the stage for the play. I fancy we stand at the threshold of something deeper, something that will demand every faculty of reason we possess." He cast another sweeping glance about the chamber, his gaze pausing upon a high bookcase, the handle of the locked door, the carpet's subtle impressions where many feet had lately stood. Then he turned abruptly to me. "Watson, note down everything. This case, if I'm not mistaken, shall test us more severely than any we have yet encountered. Midnight has its own secrets, and the manuscript is but the surface of the puzzle." And with that solemn pronouncement, he bent once more to his minute examination, while Lestrade muttered his scepticism and Professor Endicott sank wearily into his chair. I sensed the true beginning of our inquiry had only just commenced, and that the hours ahead would reveal matters far stranger than a mere theft or killing. Holmes was upon his knees beside the hearth when the next curious detail presented itself. With that feline swiftness which marked his every movement in the midst of a case, he drew from beneath the iron grate a narrow ribbon of wax. It was dull red, cracked along its edge, and bore the faint impression of letters as though it had once sealed a folded sheet. "A fragment of a seal," he murmured, holding it to the lamplight. "And here observe, Watson, the crest of a bird's wing, though much effaced. This, combined with the torn scrap you examined earlier, suggests that the manuscript was not merely snatched up, but tampered with, opened, inspected, perhaps altered." The professor gave a feeble moan and clutched at his temples. "Tampered with? Impossible. It was my own hand that opened the chest in which it came, sealed with wax untouched since the convent library of St. Omer. Whitmore and I verified it together." Holmes, without looking up, said only, "Seals can be imitated, Professor. The age of wax is not certain proof." Lestrade gave a grunt of impatience. "This is hair-splitting. We have a dead man, a vanished paper, and the only person in the room who lives to tell the tale to your professor here. What more does a magistrate need?" Holmes's reply was as cold as the fog seeping at the windows. "The magistrate may suffice himself with appearances, Inspector. I do not. We seek truth, not convenience." He rose suddenly, striding across the room to the tall bookcase that lined one wall. "Watson, do you observe anything unusual here?" I followed his gaze. The shelves were burdened with volumes of theology, pale folios, and stacks of loose papers. At first glance, I could see nothing remarkable. Yet Holmes's long finger pointed to the lowest shelf, where a fine dust lay undisturbed, save for one streak, a faint, fresh disturbance, as if some narrow object had been withdrawn. "You see, Watson," he said softly, "this shelf had not been touched for months. Yet tonight someone reached here, and for what? That is the question." The professor, rising with effort, peered over Holmes's shoulder. "That shelf contains only Latin sermons of the 15th century, worthless save to the most patient antiquary." Holmes inclined his head. "Worthless? Perhaps. Yet someone found a reason to disturb them. We must leave nothing unexamined." He drew out the nearest folio. As he did so, a small shower of dust fell upon his sleeve, and I noticed the impression of a square shape where the dust had not settled evenly. Holmes removed another volume, then another, until he exposed a small recess at the back of the shelf, cunningly fashioned into the woodwork. Within it there was nothing but a faint impression upon the dust, as though a bundle of papers had rested there not many hours ago. "A hiding place," said Holmes, his voice low. "And recently emptied. Tell me, Professor, did you know of this?" Endicott shook his head in wonder. "Never, never! That recess must have been contrived before my tenancy. Why, I have studied in this room for 2 decades without suspecting it." Holmes replaced the books with deliberate care. His eyes had grown brighter, the keenness of the chase upon him. "Then we must ask ourselves who among this household would know of such obscure contrivance. Not the servants, surely. They have neither wit nor reason to meddle with your folios, Whitmore?" "Perhaps, but then why hide that which he himself had been tasked to examine?" I was about to hazard a suggestion when Holmes suddenly wheeled to the desk where a lamp still burned low. He bent over the blotter, sniffed the surface, and straightened with a curious expression. "Petrol," he remarked. "There has been a lamp filled here recently, but more than that, a small drop has singed the corner of the scrap we discovered. Watson, do you not perceive? Fire was close at hand, yet the paper is not destroyed. Why?" I admitted myself at a loss. To my medical eyes, the charred edge spoke only of carelessness. Holmes tapped the side of his nose. "Careless hands do not arrange locked rooms and vanished manuscripts. Nowhere we have intent. Someone wished to test the manuscript's authenticity, perhaps, by flame and seal. Yet they carried it away intact. The reason must lie in what it contained." Professor Endicott wrung his hands. "Its contents are of priceless value. The treatise of Brother Anselm touches upon ancient histories that challenge our very chronicle of kings. If it be lost, if it be altered, scholarship itself suffers a wound." Holmes regarded him keenly. "And who, beyond yourself and poor Whitmore, knew of its importance?" "Several, sir. Dr. Felix Hardingham of the British Museum visited but 3 days since, greatly agitated to learn I possessed it. Lord Rathbone, the collector, has made overtures more than once, offering sums beyond decency. And yes, Mr. Silas Quayle, the antiquarian dealer, who pressed me with questions at a recent lecture." "3 names, Watson," Holmes said briskly. "Mark them well." At that moment Lestrade, who had been pacing in irritation, turned sharply. "Enough of folios and scraps. I must have the body removed," and the professor questioned under oath. Holmes's gaze grew icy. "Remove the body. Certainly it is due Christian rest. But lay a hand upon the professor before I have concluded my inquiry, and you will answer for it to the yard itself. For I tell you, Lestrade, he is as much a victim here as Whitmore." Lestrade muttered under his breath, but subsided. Holmes knelt once more beside the corpse. With his magnifying lens he examined the man's cuffs, waistcoat, and the fingers of his right hand. At length he gave a small exclamation, pointing to a dark smudge upon the forefinger. "Watson, you see this?" "Printer's ink," I ventured, bending close. "Just so." Whitmore's work was not only that of a reader, but a transcriber. He had handled freshly printed sheets this very night, yet no press stands in this room. Where, then, did he acquire them? The question hung in the air. Even Lestrade was struck silent. Holmes rose, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the lamplit study. "Gentlemen, we stand at the edge of a labyrinth. Already I glimpse the shape of its corridors, though the centre lies hidden. Before dawn we must pursue each thread-ink, seal, and whisper alike. For the murderer has not merely slain a man, but has sought to bury a truth that others must never read." With that he drew his cloak about him. "Come, Watson, we have further inquiries to make, quiet ones, in the library of the British Museum. There, I fancy, lies our next glimmer of light." And so the investigation, begun in death and mystery, pressed us out into the fog-bound night once more, with questions multiplying like shadows in the gaslight. Our cab carried us through the heavy fog toward the cavernous dome of the British Museum, that sombre temple of knowledge looming pale and spectral in the lamplight. Holmes had spoken little since leaving Bloomsbury, though I could tell by the tightening of his jaw and the restless tapping of his fingers upon his knee that his mind was racing with conjectures. At last, as we descended before the deserted portico, he turned to me with that abrupt clarity which was his habit when his thoughts crystallized. "Watson, recall the names we gleaned from Endicott. Of them, Dr. Felix Hardingham concerns me most. He has access, motive, and if I mistake not a temper which will not bear disappointment. Let us see what his midnight labours reveal." A watchman admitted us, grumbling at the hour, but swayed by Holmes's card and Lestrade's authority. We passed through echoing corridors lined with marble busts, their blind eyes seeming to follow us, until we reached a small chamber set aside for scholars. There, bent over a stack of folios and surrounded by a clutter of papers, sat a thin, nervous man whose spectacles flashed as he looked up. "Mr. Holmes, Inspector," he exclaimed, rising so suddenly that a quill toppled from his desk. "This is a surprise indeed." Holmes inclined his head. "Dr. Hardingham, we regret the intrusion, but a grave matter compels us. You have heard, perhaps, of the tragedy at Professor Endicott's house?" The scholar's lips twitched, and a shadow flitted across his features. "I have heard nothing. What has occurred?" "Charles Whitmore is dead," said Holmes softly, his gaze unyielding. "And the manuscript you coveted has vanished." For a moment, Hardingham stood rigid, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. Then he sank into his chair, muttering, "Dead gone impossible." His eyes darted from Holmes to Lestrade, and his voice grew shrill. "You do not suppose that no, it cannot be." Lestrade pounced at once. "It can be, sir, and it very well may. You had cause enough by all accounts. A quarrel, perhaps, a clandestine visit, who can say?" Hardingham spread his hands, trembling. "I swear it, I was here the whole evening. Ask the porter, he saw me return after supper. I remained in this room until moments before you entered. If the manuscript is gone, it was not by my hand." Holmes, meanwhile, had wandered to the scholar's desk. He fingered the scattered sheets, examined the margins, and lifted a half-finished transcription. A faint smile touched his lips. "You are industrious, Dr. Hardingham. These are fragments of Brother Anselm, are they not?" The man flushed. "Yes, Professor Endicott permitted me to examine a portion days ago." I set about comparing it with the chronicles of Geoffrey of Monmouth. Purely academic, I assure you. "Indeed." Holmes laid the sheet gently down. "And yet this ink is scarcely dry. You have been copying from memory, or from a source you decline to name?" Hardingham stammered, "From memory only, I swear." My mind retains phrases, passages. I would never stoop to theft. Holmes's gaze was inscrutable, but he made no accusation. Instead, he turned sharply to Lestrade. We must not mistake eagerness for guilt. A scholar's zeal is no proof of murder. Yet, Watson, observe this scrap upon the floor. I stooped and retrieved a small curl of wax, twin to the fragment Holmes had found in the study. He examined it with quick satisfaction. The same crest the wing. Our friend here has more connection to Endicott's seal than he admits. Hardingham wrung his hands. I confess, I pressed him earnestly to part with the manuscript. I even sought to open his eyes to its monetary value, hinting that collectors would pay dearly. But he scorned me, and I left in despair. If a fragment of wax clings to my clothing, it is from that earlier visit, not from any midnight crime. Lestrade's eyes gleamed. It's enough for me. A warrant will have this gentleman answering in the dock. Holmes raised a hand, commanding silence. No, Inspector, guilt is not so readily demonstrated. This man is passionate, but not violent. Observe his frame slender, his wrist narrow, his grasp weak. The blow which felled Whitmore was delivered with precision and force. It required a hand trained to strike, not one accustomed to quills. No, I fancy Dr. Hardingham is but a pawn in a larger contest. The scholar sagged with relief, though fear lingered in his eyes. Then who, Mr. Holmes? Who could wish the professor harm? That, Holmes replied gravely, is what we must learn. Tell me, did you notice something unusual when you last visited Endicott? Any stranger lurking? Any sound untimely? Hardingham pressed his fingers to his brow. Only this, as I departed, I thought I heard laughter from the garden, harsh, mocking laughter. But when I turned, the fog was thick, and I saw nothing. Holmes's eyes narrowed, and he murmured half to himself, laughter in the fog and a whisper in the dark. The pattern deepens. Lestrade muttered something about phantoms, but Holmes ignored him. He turned instead to me. Watson, make note, we have a fragment of wax in two places, a scholar with motive but lacking strength, and the hint of another presence near the house. This is no simple burglary. It is a drama in which each actor plays a concealed part. Our business at the museum concluded, Holmes led us once more into the fog, his cloak swirling like a raven's wing. I could not read his expression, but I knew well the signs his mind was afire, spinning threads into a web none of us could yet perceive. As we drove back toward Baker Street, he leaned close and said, in a low tone, only I could hear, Hardingham is but the first mask, Watson. The true hand lies hidden still, but we shall have him, oh yes, we shall have him when the time is ripe. With that, he sank into silence, leaving me to ponder the tangle of scholars, collectors, and whispers in the night, and to wonder which would prove our true adversary in the riddle of the midnight manuscript. The following morning found Holmes in a state of unusual animation. When I came down to breakfast, I discovered him already pacing the sitting room, his dressing gown flying behind him like a cloak, his pipe cold but clenched between his teeth. The untasted coffee upon the table bore witness to his restlessness. Lestrade had departed in the small hours to press his case against Dr. Hardingham, though Holmes had dissuaded him from arrest. Yet the inspector's conviction lingered in the air like a stubborn fog. Holmes, I could see, meant to dispel it. "My dear Watson," he exclaimed, halting abruptly in mid-stride, "do you not perceive the absurdity of Lestrade's theory? To believe that Hardingham, a man whose arm would scarcely suffice to carry a folio, struck down Whitmore with fatal force, is an affront to reason. No, the hand that dealt that blow was both practised and deliberate. It had nothing of desperation about it. I nodded, though my medical instincts urged caution. A frail man might still resort to violence in passion. Passion leaves marks, Holmes retorted. Torn clothing, scattered objects, the frenzy of haste. What we observed was not frenzy, but calculation. The blow was precise, as though delivered with an instrument rather than the bare fist. Remember the absence of blood, the neatness of the wound. He paused, his eyes gleaming. This morning, Watson, we shall return to Endicott's study. There is a detail subtle but most telling that I would confirm. And thereafter we must pay a call upon Lord Rathbone. I fancy his lordship's polished manners conceal a most avaricious desire. Before I could reply, the cab was announced. Within the hour, we were once again within the sombre walls of the Bloomsbury house. Professor Endicott greeted us wanly, his face pale with grief and sleeplessness. The servants moved about on tiptoe, their eyes wide with fear of whispers and unseen intruders. Holmes went directly to the study without so much as a word of comfort. To him, sympathy was but a distraction when truth hung in the balance. Once inside, he closed the door firmly and drew his magnifying lens from his pocket. I watched as he examined the hearthrug, the desk, and the door itself with meticulous care. At length he beckoned me. "Watson, kneel here beside me. Do you observe anything upon the lower panel of this door?" I bent close, but at first could discern nothing save the varnished oak. Then, at a particular angle, the light caught a faint smear. "A dark stain," I said. "It might be oil." Holmes's lips curved slightly. "Not oil, my dear fellow. Grease. And not from a servant's hand. See how it lies in a streak, narrow, deliberate, at the level of a man's knee. This door has been brushed by some object and carried into the room and withdrawn with equal care." I frowned, baffled. "What kind of object?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Patience, Watson. We must not spoil the play before its climax. For now, suffice it that the object was cylindrical, metallic, and well oiled. What purpose it served we shall learn soon enough." He rose and turned his attention to the fireplace. There, kneeling once more, he probed the ashes with the poker. Presently he drew forth a small shard of metal blackened by flame. He held it delicately in a handkerchief. "Note this fragment," he said. "Part of a clasp, I think, perhaps from a case or box. Whoever sought the manuscript did not merely steal, he brought with him the means to conceal or transport it." I could not suppress an exclamation. "Then we may assume the crime was premeditated." "Most assuredly," Holmes replied. "Premeditated and executed with a coolness that belies mere theft. The whisper, the blow, the locked door each was contrived to bewilder. Yet no artifice is beyond the reach of reason." At that moment Lestrade entered, looking harried. "Mr. Holmes, I trust you are not wasting time with smudges and scraps. Hardingham is at hand, and the magistrate will have his statement by noon." Holmes's expression hardened. "Inspector, if you value your reputation, you will withhold judgment. There are forces here of which you are ignorant." Lestrade bristled. "Then name them." "Not yet," Holmes said coolly. "The time is not ripe. But mark my words, Hardingham is innocent of the killing. To press him further is to play the villain's game." Lestrade muttered angrily and withdrew. Holmes turned to me with that familiar gleam of triumph. "You see, Watson, how blind persistence can endanger justice. But come, we must not linger. There is work to be done." We left the professor to his sorrows and drove across town to Grosvenor Square, where Lord Rathbone's residence stood grand among its peers. The nobleman received us in a richly appointed library, his manner suave, yet faintly disdainful. He was a tall man of middle years, with aquiline features and a cold smile. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said smoothly, "what honour brings you to my door?" Holmes wasted no time. "We come regarding the Endicott manuscript, my lord. It is whispered you desired it keenly." Rathbone's eyes glinted. "Desired, yes. Who would not? But desire is not guilt, sir. I offered fair coin for it, nothing more. Fair coin, Holmes said softly, or extravagant sums beyond propriety? Rathbone gave a short laugh. Call it what you will. I have the means to indulge my fantasies, but if you suggest I would stoop to violence absurd? Holmes regarded him keenly. Tell me, my lord, where were you at midnight last night? In my club, Rathbone replied without hesitation. The steward will confirm it. I played whist until after 1. Holmes inclined his head. Then you will not object if I examine your study? The nobleman raised an eyebrow, but with a gesture of weary amusement he permitted us. The room revealed nothing incriminating, only shelves of books, cabinets of curiosities, and the trophies of a collector's pride. Yet Holmes lingered over a particular cabinet of medieval seals and fragments of wax. He touched one lightly, then closed the case with a click. An admirable collection, he remarked. I thank you for your courtesy. As we departed, I whispered, Holmes, do you suspect him? Holmes's face was unreadable. I suspect everyone. Watson, until the evidence forbids it. But there is one among these men whose mask shall soon slip, and when it does, we must be ready. That night, back at Baker Street, Holmes sat long in silence, the lamplight casting sharp angles across his features. At last he turned to me, his voice low but charged with intensity. Watson, there is an inconsistency so small that none but the most careful observer would note it. I shall not reveal it yet, for to do so might spoil our quarry's confidence. But mark me, the whisper in the dark was no accident of fear. It was design, most deliberate. And when I lay the final stone in this arch of evidence, the entire edifice shall reveal itself. He sank back into his chair, his eyes half closed, as though communing with thoughts known only to himself. I dared not press him. Yet I felt in my bones that the case had turned a corner, that somewhere among the fragments of wax, the whisper in the fog, and the smudge upon the door lay the clue that would lead us to the heart of the puzzle of the midnight manuscript. The following day dawned grey and oppressive, the fog lingering stubbornly over the rooftops of London, as if the city itself hesitated to reveal the secrets hidden within its streets. Holmes was already awake when I joined him in the sitting-room, his sharp eyes fixed upon the rain-streaked window, pipe unlit, hands clasped behind his back. There was an intensity about him that made the very air seem charged with expectancy. Watson, he said at last, breaking the silence, the game grows more intricate. While we dither on minor clues, events march forward of their own accord. Observing the papers this morning, a second note delivered anonymously to the British Museum. No signature, but the message is unmistakable, a threat veiled in scholarship. I took the folded sheet from his hand and read that those who seek the past may find only peril. Cease your prying, or another will join the scholar in silence. My fingers trembled slightly as I handed it back. Holmes studied the parchment with a keen eye. Observe, Watson, the quality of the paper, the ink, and the hand. A practiced scholar, undoubtedly, with steady fingers accustomed to quills. Yet the words betray impatience, a mind moved to action, not reflection. Our adversary grows bolder. He strode to the mantel and tapped a finger against the clock. The night of the manuscript theft was no random act. It was premeditated. And now, with this second communication, the stakes have risen. The criminal wishes to dictate the pace, to instill fear, and perhaps to conceal the true aim behind a veil of threat. The morning passed in tense consultation. Holmes dispatched a note to Lord Rathbone, arranging a second meeting while I accompanied him to the British Museum to interview staff and scholars about the mysterious communication. We examined every ledger, scrutinized every messenger, and inspected the delivery point for fingerprints, though in that damp, season the chances of finding anything were minimal. Yet Holmes's eyes were ever alert, catching subtleties that escaped ordinary observation, a smudge of ink upon a counter, a faint impression of a boot heel upon a threshold, the curling of a page as though handled recently. By mid-afternoon, a report arrived from Scotland Yard of a second burglary, this time at a warehouse in Whitechapel where rare antiquities had been temporarily stored. Nothing was taken save for a single curious object, a small casket of polished oak, sealed with a wax emblem identical to the fragments found in Endicott's study. Lestrade's note suggested the thief may have been testing security or, as he put it, just flaunting his cunning. Holmes's eyes gleamed at the news. A rehearsal, Watson. Our criminal grows bolder, daring us to see him, yet he leaves a signature even in the absence of theft. That workaround clue points to a mind meticulous, obsessed with control. We returned to Baker Street late in the evening, the lamps casting their golden circles across the fog-streaked pavements. Holmes went immediately to the table where the fragments and scraps were laid out in methodical order. He studied each under a magnifying glass, tracing the patterns with his finger, as though the pieces themselves might whisper their secrets. "I think, Watson," he murmured, pacing now like a caged animal, that our adversary intended the first act to appear as a locked-room mystery, complete with misdirection, the whisper, the blow, the vanished manuscript. Then the second, the note, the casket establishes both audacity and signature. Observing the wax is consistent in both instances, yet in each case it is applied differently, subtle but deliberate. Our man wishes to mislead as well as to threaten. I leaned over to examine the fragments. So this is no ordinary theft. He is playing with us. Holmes smiled faintly, though it lacked warmth. Indeed, and he wishes to be noticed. That is the most dangerous of tendencies in a criminal mind, Watson. Overconfidence often precedes error. The question is, what is his ultimate aim? Is the manuscript merely the prize, or a distraction from some other pursuit? He paused, lost in thought, before abruptly turning to me. Watson, I have not yet told you of a curious visit I received yesterday while you were otherwise occupied. A young man, quite agitated, knocked at the door and inquired about the professor. He claimed to be a distant cousin, though his manner suggested a familiarity with the household and its routines. He inquired keenly about the study's arrangement, the presence of the recess in the bookcase, and the wax fragments. I gave nothing away, merely observing. Yet his knowledge was far too detailed for a stranger. I frowned. A spy, perhaps? Or a collaborator with the thief? Possibly both, or neither. Consider he may be a decoy designed to draw our attention while the true villain moves unseen, or he may be the instrument by which our adversary gauges our responses. The clock ticked steadily, marking the passage of time as Holmes methodically laid out all items, papers, and notes from the previous nights. He examined the scorch on the manuscript scrap, the ink smudge on Whitmore's finger, the seal fragments, and the impressions upon the dusted shelves. Each, in his hands, became part of a vast, invisible map, the lines of which I could barely perceive. Finally, he sank into his chair, elbows upon his knees, eyes fixed on a point beyond the lamplight. Watson, we are no longer merely observers. We are participants in a stratagem set by a cunning intellect. Every misdirection, every whisper, every hint of threat is a thread in a web. And the spider, I fear, is watching our every move. I sat in silence, my heart quickened by the weight of the revelation. Holmes, ever composed in public, betrayed now in private a barely contained urgency. He rose suddenly. We shall move tomorrow to follow these threads. Each of our three suspects, Hardingham, Rathbone, and the anonymous messenger, must be observed. Any one of them may lead us to the heart of this puzzle, or mislead us entirely. Night fell over Baker Street, the fog pressing against the windows, and I could hear the river whispering secrets as if in sympathy with the mysteries we pursued. Holmes sat at the table, poring over fragments of wax, scraps of paper, and the faint impressions of a night's events, while I watched, both awed and apprehensive, knowing that the puzzle of the midnight manuscript had grown deeper, more dangerous, and more urgent with each passing hour. The stakes, indeed, had risen. The next morning dawned with an air of peculiar tension. Fog still clung to the streets like a pall, yet Holmes was already stirring with a vitality that bespoke his unyielding focus. I found him at the window of our Baker Street quarters, one hand pressing the glass, the other idly tapping a fragment of wax against his knee. He seemed to peer not at the London skyline, but at some vision of patterns invisible to the ordinary eye. "Watson," he said without turning, "today we shall orchestrate events to our advantage. The puzzle requires not mere observation, but subtle provocation. Our adversary, cunning as he may be, is now aware that we are pursuing him, and with that awareness comes a risk he will act, and in acting he may err." I frowned. "You speak in riddles, Holmes. What form does this strategic play take?" Holmes finally turned, his eyes glittering with an intensity that made me momentarily uneasy. "We shall invite all parties of interest under the guise of an academic consultation. A small gathering, ostensibly for the discussion of Brother Anselm's writings, yet designed to observe reactions, test alibis, and provoke the slightest slip. Fear and greed are excellent tools, Watson. They reveal as clearly as the magnifying glass. We spent the morning drafting letters of invitation. Dr. Felix Hardingham, Lord Rathbone, and, discreetly, the mysterious young man who had visited the house were each summoned to Baker Street under the pretence of consultation on textual discrepancies. Holmes was careful to disguise our true intent, for he insisted that any perception of entrapment would render the experiment useless. By late afternoon our guests began to arrive. Hardingham entered first, his hands nervously fumbling a bundle of papers. His eyes darted about, as though seeking both reassurance and escape. He greeted Holmes and me with careful civility, but the tension in his frame betrayed his apprehension. Lord Rathbone followed, tall and composed, a courteous smile upon his face, though his eyes carried the sharp glitter of concealed calculation. He had the air of a man accustomed to control, yet there was an imperceptible stiffness in his posture that hinted at unease. Lastly came the young visitor. His manner was hesitant, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed himself well prepared for scrutiny. Holmes's eyes lingered upon him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Let us proceed, gentlemen," Holmes said smoothly. "I propose that we examine several fragments of the manuscript that Professor Endicott entrusted to my care. Some discrepancies have arisen, and your expertise may shed light upon them." His words were courteous, yet they carried a subtle weight, each syllable a test. As we settled, Holmes spread the fragments across the table. "Observe these and consider which are genuine reproductions and which perhaps have been altered. Examine the ink, the paper, and the seal impressions." Hardingham leaned forward eagerly, his eyes alight with professional zeal. He began to scrutinize the documents with painstaking care, muttering observations under his breath. Rathbone observed silently, occasionally tapping a finger against the table, his gaze cool but sharp. The young visitor's attention darted between fragments, his hands trembling slightly as he handled the papers. Holmes watched them with meticulous attention, noting every gesture, every glance, every micro-expression. At length he leaned back and said, "Fascinating. You each approach the evidence differently, and in so doing reveal not only your minds, but your inclinations." Hardingham, flushed with concentration, looked up. "I cannot fathom any discrepancy here, Mr. Holmes. All appears consistent with Endicott's transcription." "Ah," Holmes said, tapping a fragment lightly. "Yet consider the wax, Dr. Hardingham. 2 of these pieces bear impressions identical to those found in the study, and one, marked with a subtle indentation, could only have been applied by someone familiar with Endicott's routine." Rathbone's smile faltered for the briefest instant. The young man shifted almost imperceptibly. Holmes's eyes, keen as ever, noted it. "Curious," Holmes murmured. "Each of you bears knowledge of the manuscript. Yet the evidence lies not merely in intellect, but in behavior. Watch closely." He placed a single fragment beneath a small glass dome, then withdrew from the table. "I must attend to another matter briefly. Remain, gentlemen." The room grew tense. Each guest became acutely conscious of their own movements. Hardingham's hands began to fidget with the papers. Rathbone's eyes flickered toward the doorway, and the young man's lips pressed tightly together, betraying a nervous energy that seemed disproportionate to the academic exercise. Holmes returned after a few moments, carrying a small, unmarked envelope. "We shall test reactions further." He placed it before the young visitor. "This contains a note of consequence from Professor Endicott's estate, discovered this very morning. You may read it aloud." The young man hesitated, then opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The message was innocuous on its surface. Simple request for consultation regarding manuscript fragments, but the reaction it elicited was anything but ordinary. His face paled, his voice faltered, and a bead of sweat formed upon his temple. Hardingham and Rathbone observed, yet neither moved, though their expressions were subtly revealing. Holmes's eyes gleamed as he took note. "Excellent," Holmes murmured softly. "Observe, Watson. Fear, anticipation, and the desire to conceal these are the clues that reason alone may miss. Our adversary believes himself unseen, yet his nature betrays him." At last Holmes addressed the room, his voice calm but incisive. "Gentlemen, this exercise concludes. I thank you for your attention and candor. Yet remember, the truth has a habit of asserting itself, regardless of secrecy or pretense. Each movement, each glance, each hesitation tells a story far beyond words." As the guests departed, Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable but his tone resolute. "We have sown the seeds, Watson. Now we wait for the harvest. One among them, I suspect, has revealed more than he knows, and when he moves next, he will do so within the parameters we have set." I could not help a shiver of anticipation. Holmes, master of deduction, had begun to play the game with a subtlety and foresight that left even me in awe. The threads of our labyrinth were now extending into the actions of others, and I sensed that the resolution of the midnight manuscript mystery drew nearer with every deliberate step. The evening settled upon London with its customary cloak of fog and shadow, and Baker Street was alive with a sense of expectancy. Holmes had spent the better part of the afternoon reviewing his notes, examining the wax fragments, and tracing the faint impressions upon the floors and furniture of Endicott's study. I observed him silently, realizing that he had reached a point where speculation was no longer sufficient. Only demonstration could illuminate the truth. Lestrade, summoned at Holmes's behest, arrived punctually, his expression a mixture of impatience and wary curiosity. I, too, was prepared, my notebook in hand, to witness the conclusion of a series of subtle manipulations that had kept me on edge for days. Holmes began by calling forth the 3 principal figures in the mystery: Dr. Hardingham, Lord Rathbone, and the enigmatic young visitor whose name I had learned was Edward Marlowe. Each entered with an air of civility masking wariness. Holmes motioned for them to be seated around the low table, and he himself took a place at its head, his tall figure composed, yet every muscle taut with controlled anticipation. "Gentlemen," Holmes began, his voice calm and precise, "you have been brought here to elucidate the final movements in a drama that began in Endicott's study and has since spread its threads across the city. The facts are simple, though their interweaving has rendered them opaque. A manuscript of great historical import vanished, a scholar was struck down, and the trail of evidence was deliberately obscured. Yet simplicity, like a well-drawn line, emerges clearly when each element is accounted for." He leaned forward, placing a fragment of wax in front of Marlowe. "Edward, you will recall this object, discovered both in Endicott's study and in a subsequent delivery. It bears the imprint of a seal, an object familiar to you, though not as a mere curiosity. You have seen it before in your studies of medieval manuscripts, have you not?" Marlowe swallowed, his hands tightening upon the edge of his chair. "I have seen similar seals, sir," he stammered. "But I do not." Holmes raised a finger. "Yet you handled it, and in doing so left subtle traces, invisible to ordinary eyes but unmistakable to a practiced observer. He indicated the blackened smudge upon the fragment, still perceptible under the lamplight. You knew precisely how to avoid leaving marks, but one small imperfection betrayed your hand." I observed Marlowe's pale face and quickened pulse. He glanced at Rathbone and Hardingham, as though seeking reassurance, finding none. Holmes continued, his voice never rising above calm authority. "The blow which felled Whitmore was delivered not in haste or rage, but with practised precision. The use of a small, weighted object, manipulated with care, accounts for the lack of blood and the neatness of the wound. A scholar of delicate hand could wield such a tool, yet only one who had observed the habits of the room and the exact position of the intended victim could strike with such accuracy." Marlowe's lips moved silently, as if forming words that would not escape. Lestrade shifted uneasily, while Holmes's eyes bored into the young man with relentless intensity. "The recess in the bookcase," he went on, "was known to you. You sought to discover the manuscript's hiding place without rousing suspicion, and in doing so you engineered the perfect scenario, the locked door, the whisper, and the apparent impossibility. Yet like all artifice it contained a flaw." He turned to Hardingham. "You, Doctor, acted as unwitting misdirection. Your eagerness to examine the manuscript provided the necessary distraction. Your zeal drew attention to your own actions while the true perpetrator moved unseen. No malice was present on your part, only curiosity, an unfortunate tool of deception." Rathbone remained silent, though the faint tightening of his jaw betrayed a tension he could not fully conceal. Holmes's gaze swept him over with an almost imperceptible appraisal. "And you, Lord Rathbone, sought only to observe the proceedings for gain, yet you were too distant to intervene, and thus irrelevant to the crime itself. The manuscript was not for you at this time." Marlowe's hands began to shake. I whispered. Holmes's sharp eyes caught the motion. "Yes, Edward. Marlowe, you acted in ambition, guided by greed and the promise of renown. You tested the wax, inspected the manuscript, and in a moment of calculated cruelty, struck down Whitmore to conceal your intent. Yet your calculations contained subtle errors. The smear upon the door, the burnt edge upon the scrap, the slight tremor as you handled the envelope at Baker Street, all betrayments invisible to ordinary scrutiny, but unmistakable to observation and reason." Marlowe's face crumpled. He attempted to speak, but no words emerged. Holmes stood, his expression serene, yet unyielding. "And so the puzzle resolves itself. The crime, seemingly impossible, was in fact the work of a careful mind, using misdirection, calculated fear, and subtle manipulation. Each action was deliberate, yet none could entirely escape the scrutiny of reason. Lestrade nodded grudgingly. "By Jove, Holmes, I never saw it until you spoke." "Brilliant, absolutely brilliant." Holmes inclined his head, his sharp features softened by the hint of satisfaction. "It is the work of logic, not intuition, Inspector." Each detail, wax, whisper, blow, recess, combined to form a sequence that was intricate, yet not beyond deduction. And now the law may act upon knowledge rather than supposition. Marlowe rose pale and defeated. "I have no defence. The manuscript I sought only to preserve it in a collection where it would be valued. I never meant for Whitmore to be harmed." His voice cracked with a mixture of fear and remorse. Holmes nodded, regarding him with measured gravity. "Intent, Edward, is distinct from execution. Yet you must answer for the consequences of your actions. The law will judge as reason has revealed the truth." At that moment, the fog outside seemed to lift slightly, the muffled clamour of the streets falling away. The web of misdirection and manipulation lay bare, and I, seated with pen poised, could scarcely believe the clarity with which Holmes had unpicked every strand. The midnight manuscript, the death of Whitmore, and the carefully engineered confusion all found their place in a structure of reason both elegant and inexorable. Holmes sank into his chair, lighting his pipe at last. "Watson," he said softly, "observed how even the cleverest hand must bend before the rigour of logic, and remember, it is seldom the obvious who commits the deed, but the one who believes himself unseen." The morning after Marlowe's confession was shrouded in an almost oppressive stillness. London seemed subdued, as if the fog itself had been held at bay by the weight of revelation. I arrived at Baker Street to find Holmes seated at the low table, pipes smouldering, eyes fixed upon the fragments and papers that had so long dominated our attention. Lestrade had already taken custody of Marlowe, and the young man's fate now rested firmly in the hands of the law, though the shadows of remorse lingered upon his countenance even in the pale light of morning. Holmes did not rise as I entered. "Ah, Watson," he said, with a hint of his habitual reserve softened by satisfaction, "our task has reached a temporary resolution. Observe the arrangement of the wax fragments and the scattered papers, every minute detail accounted for. The crime was revealed not by chance, but by the careful interpretation of evidence." I poured myself a cup of tea and seated myself opposite him. "The city seems quieter, as though even the fog respects the uncovering of truth," I ventured. "And yet the consequences remain. Whitmore is dead, and Marlowe, though caught, will face a judge. What of Professor Endicott? How does he bear the loss of both colleague and manuscript?" Holmes waved a hand in the general direction of the window. "Endicott bears it with a measure of stoicism, though he has aged markedly in these few days. I left a note this morning advising patience and care in the preservation of his remaining work. Scholars, as you know, are resilient yet fragile. Their hearts often outrun their fortitude." A knock at the door heralded the arrival of the professor himself. His eyes were red from sleeplessness, and his gait hesitant. He extended a trembling hand toward Holmes. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am beholden to you beyond expression. Without your intervention, I fear the manuscript would have been lost entirely, and poor Whitmore's fate, unchecked, might have remained a mystery." Holmes inclined his head. "The law will attend to justice, Professor. It is not I who determines consequences, but the evidence and reason that bind us to truth. You may rest assured that both are now preserved, though at a price no mind of sense can wholly dismiss." Endicott sank into a chair, his hands clasped tightly. "And Marlowe, will he be punished severely?" "He will face the magistrate," Holmes said. "Yet let us not mistake retribution for comprehension. The more curious lesson is the mind that orchestrated the sequence of events, the subtlety of misdirection, the precision of actions, the careful concealment. Each step reveals character as well as intent. That is the true insight we gain. Lestrade, who had returned to Baker Street, added with a mixture of relief and lingering suspicion, "It is astonishing, Holmes, I confess. I doubted the innocence of Dr. Hardingham entirely, and yet your reasoning has been infallible. The truth was always more intricate than I perceived." Holmes's eyes softened slightly, though the characteristic glint of analytical detachment remained. "Reason, Inspector, is the only reliable guide. Passion clouds judgment, and haste obscures the path. Observe how each detail, the smear on the door, the charred scrap, the subtle indications of wax, contributed not only to the unmasking of Marlowe, but to an understanding of motive and method. It is a lesson that must not be forgotten." Endicott's gaze shifted to me. "And you, Dr. Watson, who have chronicled these events, what do you make of it all?" I reflected for a moment, noting the stillness that pervaded the room. "It is a lesson in vigilance, Professor, in the careful observation of human nature as much as of objects. The smallest gesture, the faintest smudge, the briefest hesitation, all these have consequences when one seeks truth. Holmes has demonstrated not only deduction, but the subtle reading of character." Holmes allowed a faint smile. "Well said, Watson. And let us not forget that the city itself provides its own theatre shadows, fog, and silence, all accomplices to those who understand their use. Marlowe's error was to believe the night could conceal his design. Even the cleverest hand cannot escape the scrutiny of reason." Endicott rose at last, his expression composed, though his hands shook. "I must begin the work of restoration. The manuscript, if it survives, and the study both require care. And yet I feel a measure of peace, knowing that the truth has been revealed." Holmes inclined his head. "Peace, Professor, comes from understanding. We have revealed both method and motive. The manuscript may yet endure, and Whitmore's death, though tragic, will not be forgotten in the annals of scholarship." I observed the professor depart, the solemnity of his step matched by the relief evident in his eyes. Holmes settled back in his chair, pipe in hand, gaze distant yet penetrating. "Watson," he said quietly, "observed how the interplay of human ambition, fear, and cunning can craft a web most intricate. The criminal mind may plan meticulously, yet it is ever at the mercy of subtle forces, the smallest smudge, the faintest whisper, the unintended tremor." Lestrade rose to leave, casting one last glance at Holmes. "I am humbled, sir. Truly. Next time I will endeavour to trust observation more than instinct." Holmes inclined his head. "Do so, Inspector, and remember this in every puzzle. The answer lies not merely in the obvious, but in the interplay of small details that seem inconsequential until viewed through the lens of reason." As the afternoon waned, the fog outside remained, heavy and impenetrable, yet within Baker Street there was a quietude born of knowledge. The midnight manuscript had been recovered, the culprit apprehended, and yet the lesson endured. Every act, however minute, carries weight in the grand design of human affairs. I realized then, as I often did after such cases, that the resolution of a mystery provides not only justice, but insight into the subtle mechanics of character, motive, and consequence. The evening settled upon Baker Street with a calm that belied the turbulence of the preceding days. The fog pressed against the windows like a curtain, yet inside the rooms were warm with lamplight, the faint smell of pipe smoke curling in the air. Holmes sat in his usual chair, legs crossed, pipe idle in hand, staring into the amber glow of the fire. I, ever faithful chronicler, watched him, realizing that in his silence he was already considering the next intricate problem, the next shadow of mystery awaiting discovery. "Watson," he began, his voice measured and reflective, "there is a satisfaction in resolution, though it is tempered by the inevitable lesson that reason alone cannot restore the dead. Charles Whitmore is gone, yet the pattern he left behind, the trace of human ambition and misjudgment, remains a teaching in miniature." I inclined my head. "The manuscript is safe, Holmes, and the culprit apprehended. Justice, in its own measured fashion, has prevailed." Holmes allowed a small smile, though it was tempered by gravity. "Justice, Watson, is seldom absolute. It is rather the conformity of events to principle. The law will decide upon Marlowe, but understanding the recognition of motive and method that is the domain of reason and observation. And it is here, in the interplay of human character and circumstance, that the true satisfaction lies." The city beyond the window was muffled and grey, yet Holmes's mind seemed to draw clarity from the very gloom. "Observe, Watson, how each participant in this drama revealed themselves not only through overt action, but through subtleties, the tremor of a hand, the slight misalignment of wax, the momentary hesitation before speech. In every gesture lies a story, if one knows how to read it." I poured myself a cup of tea and set it upon the low table, watching him. "And you, Holmes, have deciphered all these threads with precision, revealing truth hidden even from the vigilant eyes of Scotland Yard." Holmes inclined his head, his gaze distant yet piercing. "It is not brilliance, Watson, but method, observation, deduction, and the patience to follow every thread. The criminal mind may weave with cunning, yet even the most carefully constructed web contains openings. The smallest flaw, the slightest error, can illuminate the whole design." He rested his elbow upon the arm of the chair and lit his pipe. The smoke curled upward, intertwining with the shadows. "Yet let us not mistake success for triumph. Each case resolves, and yet the world remains full of puzzles. The manuscript has been preserved, Marlowe is in the hands of the law, and the professor may continue his scholarly work, but life is ever ready with the next challenge, the next subtle riddle." I found myself admiring the serenity that cloaked him, despite the intensity that had guided the events of the past days. "It is remarkable, Holmes, how you manage to separate the intellectual resolution of a case from its emotional consequences. Most men would be consumed by the human cost." He exhaled a thin trail of smoke and regarded me with a look both piercing and contemplative. "Watson, to dwell upon consequence before understanding is folly. We measure events by what they reveal, by the pattern they form, and by the lesson they provide. Emotion, while inevitable, must not cloud judgment, yet it is precisely that interplay, the human element, that makes the exercise so compelling." I nodded, realizing that he spoke not merely of the midnight manuscript, but of all cases. Every clue, every misdirection, every gesture, each contained a reflection of the character and motive of those involved. Holmes's genius lay not only in his perception, but in the careful application of reason to the human mind in its most subtle forms. The firelight flickered across the room, and for a moment we were silent, each absorbed in thought. Then Holmes rose, walking to the window to peer out at the dimly lit street. "The city sleeps, Watson, yet it teems with stories untold, with mysteries waiting for those patient enough to discern them. And we, in our modest sphere, have played but one act upon the stage." He turned back to me, eyes sharp and keen. "Remember, Watson, every case leaves an impression, not merely in evidence collected, but in the mind's understanding. The midnight manuscript was a puzzle, yes, but it is the logic, the patience, and the unwavering observation that render any mystery intelligible." I sat back, pen poised, knowing that the narrative I would set down was as much a record of reasoning as it was of events. Holmes, ever watchful, had shown me that the resolution of a crime is not merely the apprehension of a culprit, but the illumination of truth hidden within the details overlooked by ordinary minds. As the night deepened, Baker Street settled into its usual rhythm. Outside, the fog drifted along cobbled lanes and lamps cast golden pools upon wet pavements. Inside, Holmes leaned back in his chair, pipe alight, eyes reflecting both satisfaction and anticipation. The city's mysteries were many, but for now one case lay concluded, each thread unravelled with clarity, each subtle deception exposed, and the lesson of reason reaffirmed. I could not help but marvel once more at the brilliant mind beside me, always alert, always calculating, yet never losing sight of the subtle dance between human nature and the rigid principles of deduction. And with that thought I prepared to record the final account of the Midnight Manuscript, knowing it would stand as yet another testament to Holmes's unerring genius. The morning after the apprehension of Edward Marlowe brought with it a clarity that seemed to reach even the fog-bound streets of London. Baker Street, quiet in its habitual rhythm, felt charged with the residual energy of a case resolved. Holmes sat near the fire, his tall frame leaning slightly forward, eyes half closed as if communing with thoughts that belonged to the mind alone. I, seated opposite him, found the weight of reflection pressing upon me, a mixture of relief, admiration, and lingering sorrow for the young assistant whose life had been claimed by ambition and misjudgment. Holmes spoke first, his voice calm yet edged with the intensity of contemplation. Watson, in every case there exists a duality between action and consequence, between visible evidence and the hidden motives that propel it. The Midnight Manuscript has returned to Professor Endicott, yet the shadows of ambition, fear, and folly remain indelibly imprinted upon those who participated. That is the true lesson we extract. I stirred the fire embers as he continued. Observe the manner in which Marlowe acted. Each step was measured, deliberate, yet flawed. He believed himself unseen, yet the slightest trace of the smudge of wax, the burnt edge upon a scrap, the whisper at midnight betrayed him. In that, Watson, lies the beauty and the inevitability of deduction. No craft is perfect, no deception absolute when examined with patience, observation, and reason. I could not restrain a question. Holmes, do you ever feel that justice, as administered by the law, suffices when so much human frailty is involved? Whitmore is gone and Marlowe must answer for his crime, yet the manuscript survives and Endicott endures. Is that enough? Holmes's gaze, sharp and penetrating, met mine. Enough? Justice is rarely about completeness, Watson. It is about the alignment of events with principle and evidence. We understand the motives, trace the sequence, and reveal the method. The law attends to consequence, reason attends to truth. That is sufficient for our purpose. Human affairs are rarely tidy, yet clarity can still be imposed upon chaos. A gentle knock at the door heralded the arrival of Professor Endicott. His countenance bore the subtle relief of a man who has seen peril pass, yet retains the shadow of its memory. He entered slowly, bowing his head in deference to Holmes and me. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began, voice tremulous, but composed. "I cannot express the depth of my gratitude. The manuscript is restored, and though I grieve for Charles Whitmore, I feel the enormity of your achievement in revealing the truth. I had feared all was lost." Holmes inclined his head with quiet gravity. "Professor, it is not my doing alone. Observation, deduction, and careful patience revealed what the human eye might otherwise overlook. Your grief is understandable, yet reason has prevailed where fear and ambition sought to obscure the facts." Endicott's eyes wandered over the fragments and wax remnants arranged methodically on the table. "And the others?" "Hardingham, Lord Rathbone? How shall they endure the revelations of their involvement or proximity to this crime? Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. Dr. Hardingham played a role born of curiosity, not malice. His intentions were misapplied, yet no hand guided him toward wrongdoing. Lord Rathbone observed, yet refrained from action. Prudence and caution were his shield. The human mind, when aligned with logic, can discern peril before it manifests. Each participant now comprehends the limits of ambition and the consequences of misjudgment. I ventured to ask, "And you, Holmes? Do you feel the conclusion brings peace?" Holmes's eyes, luminous with thought, held a distant gleam. "Peace, Watson, is ephemeral. Resolution is momentary, though instructive. Each case teaches, each puzzle imparts understanding. Whitmore's death reminds us of human fragility, Marlowe's error of the perils of unchecked ambition, and the manuscript itself, though preserved, illustrates the delicate value of knowledge. These lessons endure beyond the immediate resolution." He stood and moved to the window, the lamplight glinting upon the fog-bound street. "Consider London, Watson, a city of millions, each life intersecting countless others, each action influencing a web unseen. The cleverest mind may manipulate, the boldest may deceive, yet in time, even the most subtle thread reveals itself to careful scrutiny. That is the immutable truth. No design is so intricate that observation cannot, in due course, unravel it." I could only nod, absorbing the weight of his reflection. Holmes turned at last, resting a hand upon the mantel. "We have now concluded this episode of the Midnight Manuscript. The law will see Marlowe adjudicated, Endicott will resume his scholarship, and London will continue, unaware of the precise forces that guided events. Yet within the quiet corridors of reason, the sequence is complete, the puzzle resolved." The professor inclined his head, bowing in gratitude once more. Lestrade, who had returned briefly to observe the final consultation, gave a curt nod of respect, and I, pen in hand, felt the privilege of chronicling a case wherein intellect and patience had illuminated truths beyond the ordinary eye. Holmes sank into his chair once more, lighting his pipe with calm deliberation. "Watson, remember that it is not brilliance alone nor chance that solves a mystery. It is attention to detail, the cultivation of observation, and the unwavering application of logic to the hidden impulses that guide human action. In that, as ever, lies the satisfaction of our work." The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the city pulsed with life indifferent to the resolution achieved within these walls. Yet for those of us who had witnessed the unraveling of the Midnight Manuscript mystery, the lesson endured. Reason, patience, and perception remained the truest instruments of justice. And as Holmes leaned back, eyes glinting with quiet satisfaction, I knew the city's shadows would continue to conceal mysteries, waiting for the day when his singular intellect would illuminate them once more.